We live in an age where secular ideologies spread with the fervor of religious movements, yet we fail to recognize their essentially spiritual character. What appears as rational political discourse often conceals a more fundamental phenomenon, the metastatic spread of gnostic faith structures that promise earthly salvation through ideological commitment. This is not merely political disagreement, it is spiritual infection masquerading as enlightenment. The modern mind, having abandoned transcendent order, becomes vulnerable to counterfeit absolutes that offer meaning through collective action. These ideological viruses penetrate consciousness not through reasoned argument but through the appeal to frustrated spiritual longings. They promise what religion once provided: ultimate meaning, final answers, and the transformation of existence, but locate these promises entirely within historical time. Today we must examine how ideas become infections, how political movements acquire religious intensity, and why the cure for ideological possession requires not better arguments but recovered spiritual health. The stakes could not be higher. Our civilization's capacity for authentic order hangs in the balance. Chapter 1: The Spiritual Vacuum That Invites Infection. Modern man's abandonment of transcendent reality has created a spiritual vacuum that nature abhors. When consciousness loses its moorings in the divine ground of being, it does not simply become neutral, it becomes actively susceptible to pseudo-religious substitutes that promise to fill the void. This is the fundamental misunderstanding of secular modernity, the belief that human beings can live purely rational, this worldly lives without consequence. The great ideological movements of our time, whether progressive utopianism, scientific materialism, or revolutionary nationalism, all exhibit the same underlying structure. They begin by diagnosing humanity's alienation and suffering, correctly identifying the spiritual poverty of modern existence. But then they commit the fatal Gnostic error. They promise to eliminate this alienation through knowledge and action confined entirely to the temporal sphere. Consider how contemporary political movements acquire their extraordinary intensity. Followers do not simply agree with policy positions, they experience conversion experiences, speak in the language of revelation and salvation, and view opponents not as fellow citizens with different views but as obstacles to human redemption. This is not political enthusiasm, it is displaced religious fervor seeking earthly objects of ultimate concern. The infection spreads precisely because it offers what secular rationalism cannot: meaning, purpose, and the promise of participating in something greater than oneself. The ideologically possessed individual experiences a restoration of existential significance that secular culture has systematically undermined. No wonder rational arguments prove powerless against such possession. One does not argue someone out of a religious experience. What makes these movements particularly dangerous is their ability to recruit the natural human desire for transcendence while simultaneously denying transcendence itself. They offer the psychological benefits of religious commitment while promising that such commitment requires no acknowledgement of mystery, no acceptance of human limitation, no submission to divine authority. It is religion without God, salvation without grace, transcendence without the transcendent. The result is a peculiar form of spiritual satisfaction that actually increases rather than resolves the underlying spiritual crisis. Like a drug that provides temporary relief while deepening addiction, ideological commitment offers the feeling of meaning while systematically destroying the conditions that make authentic meaning possible. The infected consciousness becomes increasingly dependent on the ideological framework for basic psychological stability, making rational discourse impossible and recovery extraordinarily difficult. This is why ideological movements display such remarkable similarity to viral infections. They exploit existing vulnerabilities, reproduce themselves through contact with healthy systems, and ultimately weaken their hosts while strengthening themselves. Chapter 2: How Ideas Become Infectious Agents. Not all ideas possess infectious potential. Mathematical theorems, historical facts, and practical knowledge spread through normal processes of education and communication. But certain ideas acquire viral characteristics when they tap into fundamental spiritual needs while offering false transcendence. These ideas become dangerous not because they are false. Many false ideas remain harmlessly false, but because they provide psychological satisfaction for authentic spiritual longings through counterfeit means. The infection process follows predictable patterns. First, the idea presents itself as revelation, claiming to expose hidden truths that explain human suffering and point toward salvation. Whether this revelation concerns class struggle, racial destiny, gender liberation, or technological transcendence matters less than its claim to ultimate explanatory power. The idea promises to make sense of existence in ways that traditional sources of meaning allegedly cannot. Second, the infectious idea creates a sharp distinction between the enlightened and the unenlightened, the awakened and the sleeping, the progressive and the reactionary. This division serves multiple functions. It provides the infected consciousness with a sense of superiority and special knowledge. It explains resistance to the idea as evidence of spiritual or intellectual deficiency, and it creates social pressure for conversion through the promise of joining an elect community. Third, the idea demands not mere intellectual assent but total existential commitment. Like a virus that hijacks cellular machinery to reproduce itself, the infectious idea reorganizes the entire personality around its central claims. Every aspect of experience, personal relationships, professional choices, aesthetic preferences, moral judgments, becomes filtered through the ideological framework. The infected person begins to think not with the idea but within it. The most dangerous characteristic of ideological infection is its ability to immunize itself against criticism. Any questioning of the idea becomes evidence of the questioner's spiritual blindness, moral corruption, or psychological dysfunction. The idea creates its own criteria of truth and falsehood, making rational evaluation impossible from within the infected consciousness. This is why ideological movements often appear immune to empirical disconfirmation. They have developed sophisticated mechanisms for interpreting contrary evidence as confirmation of their basic claims. The spread occurs through social networks where infected individuals serve as carriers, transmitting not just the idea's content but its emotional and spiritual appeal. Universities, media institutions, and cultural organizations become vectors of transmission, often without conscious awareness of their role in the process. The infection spreads most rapidly in environments where traditional sources of meaning have been systematically undermined, leaving populations spiritually vulnerable and psychologically desperate for transcendent purpose. Understanding this process is crucial for both preventing infection and treating those already affected. The cure cannot be merely intellectual, it must address the underlying spiritual needs that make individuals susceptible to ideological possession in the first place. Chapter 3: The Psychology of Ideological Possession. When examining the consciousness of those captured by ideological movements, we encounter a fascinating and troubling phenomenon: the simultaneous expansion and contraction of awareness. The possessed individual experiences a sense of profound insight and elevated consciousness while actually suffering from a systematic narrowing of perception that makes authentic experience increasingly impossible. Think carefully about your own encounters with ideologically possessed individuals. You will notice that they speak with extraordinary confidence about complex historical, social, and metaphysical questions. They possess ready explanations for every phenomenon, clear prescriptions for every problem, and absolute certainty about humanity's proper destiny. This apparent omniscience masks a more troubling reality: the gradual replacement of genuine curiosity, wonder, and openness to experience with a closed system of interpretation that admits no fundamental questions. The psychological appeal of such possession cannot be underestimated. Modern man suffers from what we might call existential vertigo, the disorienting loss of meaning that follows the collapse of traditional ordering symbols. Ideological possession offers immediate relief from this vertigo by providing a comprehensive framework for understanding self, society, and cosmos. The possessed consciousness trades the anxiety of authentic questioning for the comfort of certainty, the burden of personal responsibility for the satisfaction of collective purpose. But this trade involves a fundamental corruption of consciousness itself. The human being is constituted by the tension between temporal existence and eternal destiny, between knowledge and mystery, between autonomy and dependence on transcendent reality. Ideological possession resolves these constitutive tensions through artificial means, creating a false peace that actually represents spiritual death. The possessed individual no longer experiences the anxiety that signals authentic existence because they have ceased to exist authentically. This explains the peculiar quality of ideological discourse, its combination of passionate intensity with fundamental unreality. The possessed person speaks about justice, truth, freedom, and human dignity with apparent sincerity, but these words have been emptied of their transcendent content and refilled with immanent political meaning. Justice becomes the victory of their movement, truth becomes conformity to their doctrine, freedom becomes liberation from traditional constraints, and human dignity becomes participation in their cause. The corruption extends to the most basic operations of consciousness. Perception becomes selective, filtering experience through ideological categories. Memory becomes revisionist, reconstructing the past to conform with present beliefs. Imagination becomes utopian, projecting ideological fantasies onto future possibilities. Even love becomes instrumentalized, extended only to those who share the ideological commitment and withdrawn from those who resist or question it. Perhaps most tragically, the possessed consciousness loses the capacity for genuine encounter with other human beings. Every person becomes either an ally to be recruited, an enemy to be defeated, or a potential convert to be transformed. The simple recognition of another human being as a fellow participant in the mystery of existence becomes impossible because mystery itself has been eliminated in favor of ideological certainty. This is why rational argument proves so ineffective against ideological possession. The possessed person has not arrived at their position through reasoning that could be reversed through better reasoning. They have undergone a transformation of consciousness that makes the premises of rational discourse inaccessible. They have traded the burden and dignity of authentic human existence for the comfort and imprisonment of systematic self-deception. Recovery requires not better arguments but restored spiritual health, the recovery of openness to transcendent reality that makes authentic existence possible. Chapter 4: The Historical Pattern of Spiritual Epidemics. The phenomenon of ideological infection is not unique to modernity, though it has reached unprecedented scale and intensity in our time. Throughout history, whenever traditional ordering symbols have weakened or collapsed, populations have become vulnerable to movements promising earthly salvation through special knowledge and collective action. Understanding this historical pattern reveals both the permanence of the underlying spiritual need and the variety of forms that counterfeit satisfaction can take. Consider the Gnostic movements of late antiquity, which arose precisely when the classical polis and traditional religion could no longer provide meaningful order for human existence. These movements promised escape from the corrupted material world through secret knowledge available only to initiates. They diagnosed the human condition as fundamentally flawed but offered liberation through understanding hidden truths about the nature of reality. The parallels to modern ideological movements are striking: the claim to special revelation, the division of humanity into enlightened and unenlightened, and the promise of salvation through knowledge and commitment. Medieval Europe experienced similar outbreaks during periods of social crisis and institutional breakdown. Millenarian movements promised the imminent establishment of God's kingdom on earth, often through violent struggle against existing authorities. These movements combined legitimate spiritual aspirations with the fatal error of attempting to realize transcendent hopes through temporal means. They anticipated the structure of modern revolutionary movements, the diagnosis of present suffering, the promise of future perfection, and the demand for total commitment to the transformative cause. The modern period has witnessed an explosion of such movements, each claiming to offer scientific rather than religious salvation. Marxism promised liberation through understanding the laws of historical development. Fascism offered redemption through racial or national destiny. Progressive liberalism promotes salvation through technological and social engineering. Contemporary movements continue this pattern, whether promising environmental salvation through lifestyle transformation, gender liberation through the destruction of traditional categories, or technological transcendence through artificial intelligence and genetic manipulation. What makes the modern situation particularly dangerous is the combination of ancient spiritual needs with unprecedented technological and organizational power. Historical Gnostic movements remained relatively contained because they lacked means for mass communication and social mobilization. Modern ideological movements can spread with viral speed through global communication networks, coordinate action across vast territories, and mobilize resources on scales unimaginable to previous eras. Furthermore, modernity has systematically weakened the traditional institutions that once provided immunity against ideological infection. Classical education, which cultivated intellectual humility and appreciation for transcendent mystery, has been replaced by specialized training that produces experts rather than wise human beings. Religious institutions, which once oriented consciousness toward eternal rather than temporal concerns, have either secularized themselves or retreated into irrelevant fundamentalism. Political institutions, which once embodied the tension between human aspiration and human limitation, have become vehicles for implementing ideological visions. The result is a civilization that produces both unprecedented vulnerability to ideological infection and unprecedented capacity for its spread. Entire populations can be swept into movements that promise to solve the human condition through political action, technological innovation, or cultural transformation. The scale of modern ideological disasters, from Nazi Germany to Soviet Russia to the ongoing cultural revolution in Western universities, demonstrates the catastrophic potential of spiritual epidemics in technological societies. Yet the historical pattern also offers hope. Previous civilizations have survived similar crises by recovering ordering symbols that acknowledge both human dignity and human limitation, both temporal responsibility and eternal destiny. The classical philosophers and biblical prophets developed wisdom traditions that can still provide guidance for those seeking to restore spiritual health in our disordered time. Chapter 5: Recognition and Resistance: Developing Spiritual Immunity. How does one recognize ideological infection, particularly when it presents itself as rational discourse or moral progress? The symptoms are subtle but consistent: the gradual replacement of wonder with certainty, mystery with explanation, and authentic encounter with ideological analysis. When someone begins viewing every aspect of existence through a single interpretive framework, claiming comprehensive understanding of complex historical and social phenomena, and losing the capacity for genuine surprise or fundamental questioning, the infection has likely taken hold. Pay attention to changes in language and perception among those around you. The infected consciousness begins speaking in abstractions rather than concrete experiences, reducing human beings to representative categories rather than encountering them as unique individuals. Personal relationships become instrumentalized, valued primarily for their potential contribution to the ideological cause. Past experiences are reinterpreted through the ideological lens, and future possibilities are limited to those that conform with the movement's vision. But recognition alone is insufficient. Developing immunity requires active cultivation of spiritual health through practices that maintain openness to transcendent reality. Classical philosophical education remains one of the most effective forms of prevention because it cultivates intellectual humility while expanding awareness of the complexity and mystery of existence. Reading the great works of philosophy, literature, and theology not as sources of information but as invitations to participate in fundamental questioning maintains the tension necessary for authentic existence. Contemplative practices, whether through prayer, meditation, or philosophical reflection, serve as particularly powerful vaccines against ideological infection. These practices maintain awareness of the transcendent dimension of existence while fostering the intellectual humility that makes authentic learning possible. They preserve the capacity for wonder and openness that ideological movements systematically destroy. Perhaps most importantly, developing immunity requires maintaining personal relationships that transcend ideological categories. When we love specific human beings rather than abstract humanity, when we serve particular communities rather than global causes, when we attend to concrete responsibilities rather than universal missions, we preserve the experiential foundation that makes authentic order possible. Local attachments and particular loyalties provide resistance to the universalizing claims of ideological movements. Critical thinking alone proves insufficient because ideological infection operates at a deeper level than rational discourse. The infected consciousness has developed sophisticated methods for interpreting contrary evidence as confirmation of its basic beliefs. However, critical thinking combined with spiritual practices and concrete human relationships can provide effective resistance. The key is maintaining what we might call contemplative skepticism, the ability to question all systematic claims to comprehensive truth while remaining open to genuine transcendent experiences. For those seeking to help others recover from ideological infection, direct confrontation typically proves counterproductive. The infected consciousness interprets criticism as persecution, which actually strengthens commitment to the ideology. More effective approaches focus on patient witness to alternative ways of being, gentle questioning that invites reflection rather than demands answers, and the demonstration through personal example that meaningful existence is possible without ideological commitment. Sometimes recovery occurs naturally when the ideology fails to deliver its promises or when life experiences contradict its fundamental claims. Personal suffering, loss, or encounter with genuine transcendence can break through ideological defenses in ways that argument cannot. The role of friends and family during such moments is crucial. They must be prepared to offer authentic community and meaning as alternatives to ideological belonging. The broader culture requires institutions that actively cultivate spiritual health rather than merely avoiding obvious pathologies. Educational institutions must recover their function as formative rather than merely informative environments. Religious communities must rediscover their role as guardians of transcendent mystery rather than promoters of social causes. Political institutions must embody the tension between human aspiration and human limitation rather than promising impossible solutions to permanent problems. Chapter 6: The Recovery of Authentic Order Through Anamnesis. The cure for ideological infection cannot be found in better ideologies or superior arguments, but only through the recovery of authentic experiences that ideological movements systematically obscure. This recovery, what I call anamnesis, involves the restoration of consciousness to its proper relationship with transcendent reality. It is not a return to the past but a rediscovery of permanent truths about human existence that every healthy civilization must acknowledge. The process begins with the recognition that human consciousness is fundamentally constituted by its orientation toward transcendent mystery. We are not self-contained rational agents capable of comprehensive understanding, but participants in a reality that infinitely exceeds our capacity for conceptualization. This recognition does not produce skepticism but wonder, the beginning of authentic wisdom. When consciousness recovers its proper humility before the mystery of existence, it becomes immune to ideological claims of comprehensive knowledge. Classical philosophical inquiry provides one path for such recovery. When we engage seriously with thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, we encounter minds that combine rigorous rational investigation with profound awareness of its limitations. They teach us to think clearly about fundamental questions while maintaining openness to dimensions of reality that cannot be captured in systematic doctrines. Their example demonstrates that intellectual excellence and spiritual humility are not opposed but mutually reinforcing. Biblical wisdom offers another crucial resource for anamnesis. The prophetic and sapiential traditions preserve awareness of the tension between divine transcendence and human responsibility, eternal destiny, and temporal obligation. They teach us to take historical action seriously without making it ultimate, to pursue justice without claiming perfectibility, to hope for transformation without expecting elimination of the human condition itself. The recovery process requires patient attention to ordinary experiences that ideological movements encourage us to ignore or reinterpret. The birth of a child, the death of a loved one, the beauty of nature, the experience of conscience, the encounter with great art, these common human experiences point beyond themselves to transcendent dimensions that no political program can address. When we learn to receive such experiences as genuine revelations rather than material for ideological analysis, consciousness begins to heal. Personal relationships also serve as vehicles for anamnesis when approached with proper attention. Every authentic encounter with another human being reveals something about the mystery of personhood that cannot be reduced to social, psychological, or biological categories. Love, friendship, and genuine community preserve awareness of dimensions of existence that ideological movements systematically deny or instrumentalize. The practice of anamnesis requires what we might call existential archaeology, the patient excavation of authentic experiences from beneath layers of ideological interpretation. Most people, even those deeply infected by ideology, retain access to moments of genuine wonder, love, beauty, or conscience that point beyond the ideological framework. Recovering and cultivating attention to such experiences provides the experiential foundation for spiritual health. This is not a matter of replacing one set of beliefs with another, but of recovering the capacity for authentic experience that makes genuine belief possible. The recovered consciousness does not claim special knowledge but acknowledges participation in mystery. It does not promise earthly salvation but accepts responsibility for finite human tasks. It does not divide humanity into enlightened and unenlightened but recognizes the common human condition of existence in tension between temporal and eternal dimensions. Such recovery typically occurs gradually through sustained attention to transcendent reality in its various manifestations. Reading, prayer, contemplation, service, and authentic relationship all contribute to the process. But the movement must come from within. No external authority can restore spiritual health to consciousness that has lost its moorings in transcendent mystery. The recovered consciousness becomes a source of healing for others, not through proselytizing but through witness to alternative possibilities for human existence. Chapter 7: Building Islands of Order in an Age of Ideological Chaos. In times of civilizational crisis, when ideological infections rage through major institutions and traditional sources of order have been compromised, authentic human beings must create what I call islands of order, small communities where genuine spiritual and intellectual health can be maintained and transmitted. These islands serve as beacons of hope and centers of resistance against the metastatic spread of counterfeit transcendence. Such islands cannot be artificially constructed through ideological programs or institutional reforms. They emerge naturally where individuals committed to transcendent reality gather for authentic purposes: the pursuit of truth, the cultivation of virtue, the preservation of genuine culture, and the service of authentic human needs. Universities, churches, families, professional associations, and cultural institutions can all become islands of order when their participants recover proper orientation toward transcendent mystery. The first requirement for building such islands is the recognition that spiritual health cannot be separated from intellectual integrity. Communities that hope to resist ideological infection must cultivate rigorous thinking while maintaining openness to mystery. This means recovering classical educational ideals that form whole human beings rather than specialized experts, that teach wisdom alongside knowledge, and that preserve awareness of permanent questions alongside contemporary concerns. Educational reform within such communities must emphasize the great works of philosophy, literature, theology, and science that have shaped human consciousness throughout history. But these works must be approached as living documents that invite participation rather than mere objects of historical study. Students must learn to engage with Plato's dialogues, Augustine's confessions, Dante's visions, and Shakespeare's insights as contemporaries addressing permanent human concerns rather than antiquated voices from irrelevant past. The island communities must also maintain practices that preserve consciousness of transcendent reality. Whether through liturgical worship, philosophical contemplation, artistic creation, or simple attention to natural beauty, members must regularly engage in activities that orient awareness beyond the temporal and political. These practices serve as vaccines against ideological infection by maintaining the experiential foundation for authentic spiritual life. Economic and social organization within island communities requires careful attention to scale and purpose. Large-scale institutions become vulnerable to ideological capture because they lose connection to concrete human relationships and particular places. Islands of order must remain small enough that members know each other personally, particular enough that they serve specific human needs, and local enough that they maintain connection to real communities rather than abstract causes. This does not mean withdrawal from broader social responsibilities. Islands of order serve their surrounding communities through excellence in particular vocations: teaching, healing, creating, building, governing, and serving. But they approach these responsibilities from the foundation of authentic spiritual life rather than ideological commitment. They seek to serve real human needs rather than implement abstract programs for social transformation. The preservation and transmission of genuine culture represents another crucial function of island communities. In an age when traditional cultural institutions have been captured by ideological movements, small communities must maintain access to authentic artistic, literary, and intellectual traditions. This requires not museum piece preservation but living engagement that demonstrates the continuing relevance of classical insights for contemporary existence. Perhaps most importantly, island communities must learn to live with hope that does not depend on historical success. They cannot promise to solve the civilizational crisis through their efforts or to transform the broader culture through their example. Their hope must be grounded in transcendent reality rather than temporal possibilities. This paradoxically makes them more effective agents of genuine renewal because they work from love rather than ideology, service rather than ambition, truth rather than utility. The islands serve as seeds of renewal that may eventually contribute to broader cultural recovery, but such outcomes cannot be guaranteed or even predicted. The communities must be valuable in themselves, worthwhile regardless of their broader impact. They exist because authentic human life requires authentic community, not because authentic community promises to reform an inauthentic civilization. Members of such communities become natural centers of resistance to ideological infection in their various spheres of activity. Their spiritual health makes them immune to counterfeit transcendence while their intellectual formation enables them to recognize and respond to ideological claims. They serve as living demonstrations that meaningful existence is possible without ideological commitment, that genuine community can exist without political uniformity, and that authentic hope transcends historical circumstances. Conclusion. The metastatic faith of ideology spreads through spiritual vacuum, not intellectual confusion. It infects souls hungry for transcendence with counterfeit absolutes that promise earthly salvation while systematically destroying the conditions that make authentic meaning possible. Understanding this phenomenon as fundamentally spiritual rather than merely political transforms our approach to both prevention and cure. The hope for recovery lies not in better arguments against particular ideologies but in the restoration of consciousness to its proper relationship with transcendent mystery. When human beings recover awareness of their participation in a reality that infinitely exceeds their comprehension, they become naturally immune to movements that promise comprehensive knowledge and ultimate solutions through temporal means. This recovery occurs through patient attention to the permanent experiences that constitute authentic human existence: wonder before mystery, love of particular persons, responsibility for concrete tasks, and openness to transcendent beauty, truth, and goodness. Islands of order emerge where such consciousness is cultivated and preserved, serving as centers of resistance and seeds of renewal. The struggle against ideological infection is ultimately the struggle for the human soul itself. In an age of counterfeit transcendence, our highest responsibility is the preservation and transmission of authentic spiritual life that makes genuine order possible.